I didn't notice the war at first. That's the part people never understand. They think harassment announces itself, raised voices, threats, doors slammed. They imagine a moment where you can point and say, there. That's when it started. But this wasn't like that. This was quieter, polite, patient. It began during the most ordinary stretch of my life. Not a crisis, not a scandal, just a long season of tiredness. Work had been heavier than usual. My mother's health was slipping in ways doctors couldn't name yet. Sleep became something I chased instead of something I had. That's when they started watching. At first, it looked like coincidence. A car parked a little longer than necessary across the street. A clipboard held just a second too long while someone pretended to admire a flower bed. Neighbors who'd waved for years, suddenly pausing, studying, calculating. Still nothing official. Nothing you could complain about without sounding paranoid. That was intentional. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Thin envelope, neutral font, no accusation in the subject line, just courtesy notice. Courtesy. That word did a lot of work. They mentioned my trash bin placement. According to the letter, it had been visible from the street for an extended period. No fine, no demand, just a reminder. I laughed when I read it. Actually laughed. Folded it neatly and slid it into a drawer. If I'd known then what that letter really was, I would have framed it. Evidence of the opening move. The next notice came 2 weeks later. Landscaping. Grass length. Nothing dramatic. Still polite. Still patient. What I didn't realize was that the notices weren't about rules. They were about timing. They never arrived on calm weeks. They showed up after deadlines. After overtime. After nights when I'd slept 4 hours and called it enough. I started feeling watched without being able to explain why. That constant low hum in the chest. The sense that something was off but not enough to justify alarm. That's how exhaustion works. It dulls your instincts. It makes you doubt yourself. By the third letter, I stopped laughing. This one came with photos. Printed. Grainy. Taken from angles that felt intimate. A crack in the fence. A shadow near the shed. Things no one would ever notice unless they were already looking for them. Still no fine. Still no deadline. Just documentation. That was the moment I should have pushed back, but exhaustion makes confrontation feel expensive. So I complied, fixed the fence, trimmed the grass, moved the bin exactly where the diagram showed. And that's when they escalated. Once they saw I responded, the pace changed. Notices came faster. The language shifted. Less courtesy, more compliance required. I tried attending a meeting. Sat in the back of a folding chair room with fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. They smiled when I walked in. Used my name too easily. They spoke slowly, deliberately, like teachers explaining rules to a child who'd already failed the test. Nothing personal, one of them said, hands folded. Just standards. Standards. Another word that hides intent. What I didn't know then was that the real strategy wasn't enforcement. It was attrition. They didn't want me angry. Anger has energy. They wanted me tired, confused, second-guessing. They never hit all at once. One issue at a time. Just enough to keep my attention divided. I'd wake up already bracing. Open my email with a tight chest. Check the mailbox like it might bite. That's when sleep really left. Every sound at night felt amplified. Car doors, footsteps. The click of something metallic from the street. I told myself it was stress. That I was imagining patterns because I was worn down. That's another thing exhaustion does. It turns certainty into something slippery. Then the inspections started. Unannounced, of course. Perfectly legal under the bylaws. I hadn't read closely enough. They came during work hours, during doctor appointments. During the rare afternoons I tried to rest. Each time I'd return home to signs someone had been there. Gates left open. Notes taped just slightly crooked. Evidence of presence without confrontation. I started changing my routines, leaving lights on, double-checking locks, watching the street longer than necessary, and they noticed that too. The letters began referencing behavioral patterns. That phrase stuck with me, as if my reactions were the violation. That was when I realized this wasn't about the house. It was about me. They weren't correcting problems. They were collecting data, studying thresholds, learning how much pressure I could handle before I cracked or before I stopped fighting back. The final straw of part 1 came quietly. I came home one evening to a notice taped inside my door. Not mailed, delivered. It stated that due to ongoing non-compliance trends, further action may be considered. May, always may. No timeline, no specifics. Just uncertainty. I stood in my hallway for a long time holding that paper. Too tired to be angry. Too alert to relax. That's when the thought crossed my mind for the first time, soft, dangerous, and completely uninvited. Maybe it would be easier to leave. And that was the moment they'd been waiting for. Because once exhaustion makes you consider surrender, the next phase can begin. The next letter wasn't a notice. It was a welcome. Not in those words, of course. It came disguised in administrative language and formatted like routine HOA business. But the message underneath, it was clear the moment I read the first line. To assist you with compliance and prevent further escalation, the association has arranged support services. Support services. I reread that sentence 3 times, trying to make it sound normal in my head, trying to make it sound like something that happened to other people, something benign, but my skin already knew what my brain was still negotiating. They were stepping closer. I called the number at the bottom. The woman who answered spoke gently, like a nurse in a waiting room. "Oh, yes," she said. "This is standard. We coordinate with an approved vendor. It helps homeowners who are experiencing difficulty maintaining community standards." Difficulty. Like I'd been diagnosed. I told her I hadn't requested any help. "Oh, I understand," she replied. "This is preventative. It's better than the alternative." The alternative. She didn't have to say it. Fines, liens, legal letters, collection agencies, things that come with official envelopes and a slow, suffocating timeline. I hung up and immediately felt the familiar exhaustion rise like fog. Not anger, not fear, something worse. The dull sense that this was bigger than a phone call could fix. 2 days later, a pickup truck with a magnetic logo I didn't recognize rolled down my street and parked in my driveway like it belonged there. A man stepped out wearing a reflective vest and holding a clipboard. He didn't knock at first. He walked my property line, slow and deliberate, taking pictures. When I opened the door, he turned and smiled like we'd met. "Morning," he said. "I'm here for the assessment." "What assessment?" My voice sounded too sharp even to me. He lifted the clipboard unfazed. "The association work order, yard, exterior paint, fence stabilization, minor remediation." My stomach dropped. "You can't just," I started, but he cut in smoothly. "Ma'am, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to document. You can call the board if you have questions." I did call. No one answered. I left a message. My hands shook as I spoke, and I hated that they could probably hear it. Hated that I sounded exactly like what they wanted. Unstable, overwhelmed, difficult. The man made a note, nodded to himself, and walked back toward his truck. Before leaving, he turned and pointed casually at the side gate. "You should lock that," he said. "Kids cut through sometimes." Then he drove away. But that sentence stayed. "You should lock that," like he was giving advice, like he was a neighbor, except he wasn't a neighbor. He was the first physical extension of them, the first person who behaved as if my home was already a shared space. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every document I could find. Covenants, bylaws, amendments, rules that read like a foreign language designed to exhaust you before you even understand your own rights. And buried in there, under sections that looked harmless, I found it. A clause about the association's ability to enter upon the lot for maintenance after notice and failure to cure. I stared at the words until they blurred, because in my mind, enter meant trespass. In their world, it meant policy. And the worst part? They didn't need my permission. They just needed me tired enough to miss a deadline, tired enough to respond late, tired enough to become non-compliant on paper. The next week, the truck came back. This time, there were two men. They didn't knock. They opened my side gate. I heard the metal latch click from inside my house. That sound hit me harder than any shouting match ever could, because it wasn't a threat. It was a demonstration. They were showing me, we can. I rushed outside. "Stop! What are you doing?" One of them held up a folded paper like it was a shield. "Work order. I didn't approve this." "You don't have to," he said, not mean, not loud, just factual, like gravity. They trimmed hedges that didn't need trimming. They pried at the fence posts. They scraped paint from a spot I'd never even noticed. They moved things. They handled my property with a confidence that felt like theft without the drama. Then, after an hour of rearranging my home's skin, they left again. No confrontation, no apology, just completion. That afternoon, a bill arrived by email, not from the vendor, from the association. Remediation services, $680. Due in 10 days. I stared at the number, waiting for my brain to argue it away. But exhaustion didn't allow arguments anymore. It allowed only calculation. 10 days meant I'd have to move money around, cut something, delay something else. Which meant they weren't just taking space. They were taking bandwidth. They were turning my life into constant triage. I went to the next meeting. I sat closer this time. I didn't bring politeness. I brought documents, screenshots, the clause I'd found. When it was my turn to speak, the room felt oddly calm, like everyone had been expecting this. "I didn't request those services," I said. "They entered my property. They billed me." The president, a woman with perfect hair and a smile that never reached her eyes, tilted her head. "We're trying to help," she said. "Help doesn't feel like a surprise invoice." A few chuckles around the room, soft, controlled, like the audience had been cued. The president leaned forward, voice still gentle. "Homeownership is responsibility. Sometimes people fall behind, we step in." Fall behind? I felt heat crawl up my neck. "I'm not behind. I've complied with everything." She tapped her folder. "Our records show repeated patterns of non-compliance. The community has standards." The community. That phrase always arrived like a weight, like my individuality was irrelevant. I asked to see the records. She said I could submit a request. Submit a request. Wait, paperwork, delays, attrition again. When I left, I realized something that made my chest tighten. They didn't need to win the argument. They only needed to prolong it until I couldn't afford to keep showing up. 2 days later, the real invasion began. It started with a letter labeled Notice of Intent. Not a fine. Not yet. But it stated that if my account balance, including remediation fees, remained unpaid, the association may pursue further remedies. I'd seen those words before. Remedies, intent. Every May was a leash. It kept me imagining outcomes, chasing the worst-case scenario like a dog chasing headlights. That week, my mother's doctor called. New test results, more appointments, more stress. And that's when the HOA truck returned again. This time, they brought a ladder. I watched from my window as a man leaned it against my house, against my actual siding, and climbed like it was routine. No knock, no warning, just movement. Something in me snapped, not into rage, but into clarity. This wasn't enforcement. This was occupation, scaled to the level that would still look reasonable on paper. They were moving in inch by inch, invoice by invoice, clause by clause, until my home wasn't mine in practice, even if it still was on the deed. I ran outside and shouted. My voice cracked. The man on the ladder looked down like I was interrupting his day. "We're repainting the fascia," he said. "I didn't authorize that." He shrugged. "Work order." I called the police. That was my desperate card. The one you play when you need an outside authority to confirm reality. The dispatcher asked, "Are they threatening you?" "No," I said, and hated that answer. "Are they breaking in?" "No," I said, because they weren't. They were doing something worse. They were operating inside permission I never personally gave, backed by documents written to protect them, not me. The officer who arrived listened politely. He read the clause, he sighed. "Ma'am," he said gently, "this looks like a civil matter." Civil matter. Those words were a door closing. The men finished their work and drove away like nothing had happened, leaving behind fresh paint and a new invoice. And that night, when I checked my email, there was another message from the HOA. Due to continued resistance to compliance support, the association is considering additional measures to ensure community standards are met. Resistance. Not noncompliance. Not lateness. Resistance. That was the word that told me the truth. They didn't just want the yard trimmed. They didn't just want paint perfect. They wanted submission. And exhaustion was their favorite tool, because a tired person doesn't fight clean. A tired person makes mistakes. A tired person misses deadlines. A tired person signs things without reading. A tired person gives up space without realizing it. I sat in the dark with my laptop open, the glow lighting my hands, and I finally understood what moved in really meant. It didn't mean furniture. It meant authority. It meant access. It meant control. And now that they'd tasted it, they weren't going to stop at the outside of my house. They were going to come for the inside of my life. They waited until I was exhausted. Then they moved in part 3. The moment I stopped shrinking, the thing about exhaustion is that it lies to you. It tells you that compliance will buy peace. That one more payment, one more fix, one more apology will end the pressure. That if you just cooperate, the noise will stop. That lie almost broke me. The invoices kept arriving, spaced just far enough apart that I never fully recovered between them. The language hardened. Past due. Escalation. Final courtesy. Each word felt engineered to push me into reaction instead of thought. I stopped opening my curtains in the mornings. Stopped answering unknown numbers. Stopped telling friends what was happening because every explanation made me sound unstable, like I was exaggerating something minor. That's another trick of psychological warfare. It isolates you without ever saying you are alone. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or tears. It came quietly on a Thursday evening while I was folding laundry. I found myself calculating which bill I could delay if another HOA charge landed. Rent for peace. Money as anesthesia. And in that moment, something inside me went cold. Not angry, not afraid. Clear. I realized I had been living as if this situation were temporary, as if endurance itself were a solution. As if the goal was to survive until they got bored. But predators don't get bored. They escalate. They had already crossed from enforcement into control, from oversight into presence, from rules into routine intrusion. If I kept responding the way I had, tired, reactive, apologetic, they would keep advancing. So I did something that felt almost unnatural. I stopped responding, not emotionally, procedurally. I canceled automatic payments. I stopped calling. I stopped explaining myself to people who had no incentive to listen. Instead, I started documenting, not casually, not in scattered emails. I treated my own life like evidence, every notice scanned, every invoice saved, dates, times, names, photos of the ladder, photos of the truck, screenshots of emails using words like resistance and behavioral patterns. I requested records formally in writing, certified mail, return receipt. I didn't argue the content. I demanded the process. They responded slower than before. That alone told me I had changed the rhythm. The next inspection didn't happen. Neither did the next support service. Weeks passed. Silence when you're used to pressure feels wrong, dangerous. Then came the letter they didn't expect me to forward. A demand letter from a lawyer, not a threat, not a lawsuit, a question. It asked them to explain, in plain language, how repeated non-emergency entries onto my property aligned with their governing documents, state law, and fiduciary duty. It asked why invoices were issued without homeowner authorization or final violation determinations. It asked why language in official communications had shifted from compliance to behavioral judgment. It asked for names, dates, policies, and it ended with a sentence so calm it was surgical. Please preserve all records relevant to these actions. That phrase does something to people who rely on informal power. The board's reply arrived 2 weeks later. Shorter, colder, no more friendliness. They claimed their actions were misinterpreted, that the services were preventative. That entry was authorized. But something was missing: confidence. The next meeting was different. They didn't smile when I walked in. They didn't use my name casually. They stayed close to their scripts. When I spoke, I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Under which section was the latter work authorized? Why was the invoice issued before the violation hearing? Who approved the vendor access and when? Silence stretches when people aren't used to being examined. The president cleared her throat. We can take this offline. No, I said, calm, steady. I'd like the answer on record. Record, another word they didn't like. The room felt smaller, not for me, but for them. A week later, I received a notice stating that due to administrative review, all non-essential exterior services were suspended. No apology, no admission, just retreat. But here's the truth that surprised me most. The fear didn't leave immediately. Even after the pressure eased, my body stayed braced. Every sound outside still registered. Every email still tightened my chest. Psychological warfare doesn't end when the opponent withdraws. It lingers in the nervous system. What changed was my posture. I stopped shrinking. I read the documents I'd avoided before, not with dread, but with comprehension. I learned where the power actually lived and where it was bluff. I talked to neighbors quietly. Learned I wasn't the only one targeted during vulnerable moments. Illness, divorce, job loss. They didn't go after the strongest houses. They went after the tired ones. The association never fully backed down. They never admitted wrongdoing. They never apologized for entering my space like it was theirs. But they stopped advancing. And that's how you know who was really in control all along. Because true authority doesn't need exhaustion to function. What I learned, what I wish someone had told me before the first courtesy notice, is this. When someone waits until you are exhausted before they act, it's because exhaustion is the permission they need. Not legal permission. Psychological permission. They are counting on you to give up ground slowly enough that you don't notice you're retreating. The moment you stop feeding that exhaustion, by documenting, by slowing the process, by forcing them into daylight, the dynamic shifts. They don't disappear, but they stop moving in. And you reclaim something more important than a yard or a wall or a line item on a bill. You reclaim the sense that your home is not a negotiation. It is not a test of endurance. It is not a privilege contingent on compliance beyond reason. It is yours. And the quiet war ends the moment you stop trying to survive it and start refusing to participate in it at all.